The Sassoon story begins in Baghdad, early 1800s, a world of Ottoman governors, tribal politics, and merchant families who served as bridges between cultures. The Sassoons were trusted bankers and community leaders. They served as treasurers to the pashas. They were respected, stable, established, until one day they weren't. A political shift inside the Ottoman administration led to purges of prominent local families. Rumors circulated. Accusations of disloyalty appeared, likely exaggerated or fabricated. The new governor targeted the Sassoons for imprisonment. David Sassoon, the man who would later be called the Rothschild of the East, fled in the night with his family. Everything they owned gone. Everything they built left behind. They escaped to Persia, then to Bombay, an unfamiliar city on the edge of British India. From wealth to refugee status almost overnight. But here's the twist. This forced exile became the greatest opportunity of their lives. They hidden advantage. Like many Baghdadi Jews, the Sassoons spoke Arabic, Persian, Hindi, and Hebrew, and conducted business in a merchant diaspora stretching from Basra to Cairo to Calcutta, where the British had military power, where Indian princes had local authority. The Sassoons had something neither possessed: a global network of trust. This multi-city commercial network created through centuries of diaspora trade became the skeleton upon which their empire would grow. And in Bombay, something else was happening. Something the Sassoons recognized before almost anyone else. A transformation, an opening, a once-in-a-century opportunity. The British East India Company was beginning to industrialize its operations. New shipping routes were opening to China: cotton, textiles, tea, silver, and something far more profitable and far more destructive: opium. The Sassoons did not invent the opium trade. They entered an existing system built by imperial policy. But they were among the few families in the world positioned to turn that system into a multinational engine of wealth. Not by force, not by colonization, but by logistics, networks, efficiency. This is where the rise begins. The making of the Rothschilds of the East, building an empire from Bombay by the 1830s. David Sassoon had established warehouses, counting houses, and trading posts across Bombay. But what set the Sassoons apart was not scale, it was method. They created something that looked eerily modern: vertical integration of supply, shipping, distribution, diversification across cotton, yarn, textiles, silk, and spices. A multinational workforce trained in-house, family-controlled oversight across continents. Partnerships with British institutions without being absorbed by them. David Sassoon was not a colonial administrator. He was not an aristocrat. He was, above all, a strategist. And the single decision that catapulted his fortune was expanding into the China trade. The China network. While British merchants dominated through political muscle, the Sassoons dominated through speed, flexibility, and diaspora networks. Sassoon shipping routes connected. Bombay gives Hong Kong, Hong Kong gives Shanghai, Shanghai gives Nagasaki, and Yokohama, Yokohama gives London within decades. The Sassoons became one of the largest players in the India to China trade cycle. This is where the label, the Rothschilds of the East, emerged, not because they mirrored European banking practices, but because they had comparable reach, comparable wealth, and comparable ability to influence markets. But unlike the Rothschilds, the Sassoons built their power not on government bonds, but on global trade flows, flows that crossed cultures, flows that crossed regulated and unregulated markets, flows that would eventually carry them to their breaking point. Sassoon versus Sassoon. The family divide after David Sassoon's death in 1864. The empire split between two branches, the Bombay branch traditional, conservative, tied to Indian markets, the Shanghai branch, led by Elias David Sassoon, aggressively expanding across East Asia. This internal competition fueled even faster expansion. The Shanghai branch built the Sassoon Docks skyscrapers. The foremost cities in Asia had them hotels, banks, and trading houses. Their buildings became landmarks. Many still stand in Shanghai today. They were no longer just merchants. They were a dynasty. But dynasties rarely survive transitions intact. And the forces that made the Sassoons rich were the same forces that would destroy them. How the empire was lost in New China. By the early 20th century, the Sassoons were deeply entrenched in China. But China was changing. The Qing dynasty collapsed. Nationalism rose. Reforms targeted foreign influence. Economic structures were renegotiated. The Sassoons had prospered in semi-colonial treaty port environments, Hong Kong, Shanghai, where foreign merchants enjoyed protected privileges. When those privileges evaporated, so did their leverage. The fall of opium by the 1900s. Global attitudes toward opium shifted dramatically. What had once been illegal, state-sanctioned commodity became a moral, political, and diplomatic liability. International pressure mounted. Governments reversed course. Regulation tightened. The Sassoons were early to diversify. They built textile mills, shipping firms, and investment houses. But the shadow of their earlier trade weakened their political standing and made transition harder. The rise of local competitors, Chinese industrialists especially in Shanghai, began building their own trading empires. For the first time, the Sassoons weren't competing with European merchants. They were competing with rising Asian capital. The Kaduri family, the Li family in Hong Kong, Shanghai tycoons. Like the Soongs, local firms had home field advantages. Language, political networks, cultural insight, growing national influence, and unlike the Sassoons, they were rooted, not expatriate. World War II and exile again. When the Japanese invaded Shanghai, the Sassoons evacuated. Their properties were seized, their influence evaporated, their global shipping lanes collapsed, their investments froze. Their employees scattered. Once again, just like in Baghdad a century earlier, the family fled a rising storm. Except this time, they couldn't rebuild. Because the world they built their empire on no longer existed. Decolonization after the war. India became independent. China became the People's Republic. Nationalization spread across Asia. The Sassoons had assets across all three. Those assets vanished under new property laws. By the 1950s, the dynasty once called the Rothschilds of the East was reduced to a fraction of its former wealth. Their descendants lived comfortable lives in Britain and elsewhere. But the empire was gone, erased, scattered. Forgotten. Or was it? What was lost and why the world forgot, why the dynasty faded from history. Several forces buried the Sassoon. Legacy, political sensitivity. Their prosperity was tied to colonial-era trade systems many later governments wanted minimized or erased in national narratives. Family fragmentation. Unlike the Rothschilds, who maintained coordinated banking operations, the Sassoons split geographically and culturally, making it harder to preserve legacy. Rapid global change with decolonization, nationalization, wars, and shifting trade flows. The Sassoons lacked a stable foothold. Archives lost or scattered. Many family documents were destroyed during wartime evacuations. No modern megacorporation, the Rothschilds, survived through continuous banking innovation. The Sassoons had no equivalent centralized institution that evolved into the modern era. The result? An empire that once employed tens of thousands and stretched across continents became an academic footnote. But history doesn't end where the archives stop, because their influence survives often invisibly in the systems that shape our world today. Failed fixes. Why the Sassoon Empire couldn't be saved. Westernization by the 1920s-30s. Younger Sassoons embraced European lifestyles, distancing themselves from the diaspora networks that originally gave them strategic advantage. This eroded their operational cohesion. Diversification into finance. The family attempted to create Western-style banks and investment houses, but without political protection, regulatory alignment, national backing, or unified family strategy. These institutions couldn't compete with rising Western banking conglomerates. Holding companies and property, they invested heavily in Shanghai real estate. But war and revolution wiped out those assets. By the mid-20th century, almost every strategic pivot failed, not because the family lacked intelligence, but because the global system they had mastered. The world of empires, treaty ports, and merchant diasporas was disappearing. Their operating model was built for a world that no longer existed. Modern parallels. The patterns repeating today. Here's where the story comes full circle. Because the forces that made and broke the Sassoons are alive right now. Global trade empires colliding with politics today. Major multinational companies rely on cross-border networks just like the Sassoons. But geopolitical shifts, US, China tensions, sanctions, regional conflicts threaten globalized commerce in eerily similar ways. In the 19th century, the Sassoons rode the wave of globalization. In the 20th century, they were crushed by deglobalization. Which direction are we heading today? Diaspora networks running global capital. The Sassoon model looks remarkably like Silicon Valley's immigrant founder networks overseas Chinese business networks, Indian corporate diaspora networks, Middle Eastern sovereign wealth alliances. Private trust-based networks still dominate global commerce. Concentrated wealth at risk. In the 1890s, a handful of merchant families controlled global trade. Today, according to various wealth distribution studies, the richest 0.1% control more wealth than the poorest half of the planet. And as with the Sassoons, concentrated wealth is always vulnerable to regulatory shifts, public pressure, political change, conflict, technology disruption. The opium crisis and the modern opium. In the 19th century, opium was the backbone of a global trade system. Today's opium equivalents industries with massive profits, but rising political and moral scrutiny, might include data harvesting, addictive digital platforms, pharmaceuticals, fossil fuels, ultra-speculative financial instruments. History suggests these industries will face backlash. Erased history is perhaps the most important parallel. The stories that don't fit modern national narratives, like the Sassoons, get minimized or forgotten. But those forgotten stories often contain the clearest warnings. Global power is transient. The Sassoons built a multinational empire, yet a single generation of geopolitical change dismantled it. No corporation or nation is immune to structural shifts. Networks are stronger than capital. The Sassoons rose because they understood relationships, languages, and trust across borders better than anyone else. But once they abandoned those networks, their empire weakened. In the modern world, the most powerful asset isn't money, it's connectivity. What is forgotten often matters most: the absence of the Sassoons from mainstream history. Doesn't mean they weren't influential. It means their influence was uncomfortable for later political narratives. The same is true today. Much of real global power operates out of public view. A final warning: the forces that destroyed the Sassoons: deglobalization, nationalism, moral and regulatory backlash, technological displacement are re-emerging right now. History is offering us a preview of what happens when global systems shift suddenly, and those who depend on them aren't prepared. Call to action natural, not salesy.